So, welcome everyone to our third Embodied Inequalities of the Anthropocene seminar. My name is Ivana Teixeira. I'm an anthropologist and postdoc fellow at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. And together with other colleagues at UFRGS, Ceres Victra and Jean Segat, we are really very pleased to host this third seminar. Just a few words about the project. The Embodied Inequalities of the Anthropocene initiative are a collaboration between medical anthropologists at UCL in UK, CIESAS in Oaxaca, Mexico, and the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil. In the first seminar, we talked with Renzo Taddei from the New School in New York about plastic and toxicity. In the second seminar, we talked with Elizabeth Roberts from the University of Michigan about the development of bioethnography, talking about leading Mexico City. Our next seminar after this one today will be on 8th February with Dario Kopenawa, a Yanomami leader. He will approach illegal mining and its consequences of indigenous peoples. Further information can be found on the link in the chat. So today, it's a real pleasure to welcome our third speaker for the series, Renzo Taddei. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Renzo Taddei is an anthropologist and professor at the Federal University of São Paulo, Brazil. His research focuses on the socio-cultural dimensions of how humans relate to the atmosphere. He has written on climate forecasting, disasters, geoengineering, and indigenous environmental knowledge. I would like to say to those who are watching the lecture just one more time that you can turn on the closed caption in Zoom for an English transcription or for translation into Portuguese or Spanish. We're also able to receive questions at any point on the chat function. We will discuss it after the talk. Professor Renzo, thank you once again for being with us, and we are ready to listen to you.
Thank you, Ivana. Thank you, everyone in the project for inviting me. I will share my screen now. Second. Okay. So the title of my talk is "Can the Indigenous Subaltern Speak at the IPCC?" I will, in the beginning of my talk, speak a little bit about my trajectory, so my placement in this debate becomes clear. So I'm not speaking on behalf of indigenous peoples in any way, as you will see. And so my research has historically been more to the side of the science, or the climate sciences in general, than to the indigenous people. Technically speaking, I'm not a specialist on indigenous populations in Brazil or anywhere else. Well, first of all, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking from the lands of the Guarani people and other indigenous peoples of the Tupi-Guarani language family. This is something that is not usual in Brazil, and not everything that comes from the north is necessarily good, but this is one of the things that I think that universities in Brazil should adopt. Okay, so let me start. I started my trajectory doing ethnographic research in the northeast area of Brazil, in the border area where meteorology interacts with other segments of society. So my main goal was understanding how climate and atmospheric information in general was used in political debates and in the politics of the state of Ceará in northeast Brazil. And in the process of doing that research, I encountered traditional environmental knowledge, and particularly in that place in the interior of Northeast Brazil, one of the expressions used to talk about those people were rain prophets. That was a term that they didn't like because of the expectations that come from the idea of profit. But anyway, those were mainly small farmers, family-based agricultural individuals that, for having lived their entire lives on working on the fields, they learned to identify transformations, the signs of the transformations in the ecosystems and the approaching of rains, which is in Northeast Brazil is a semi-arid ecosystem. So rains are very valuable. And so this is a kind of a general knowledge. Most people know how to do it. So what caught my attention about the rain prophets is that there was something else going on there. I mean, some form of identity construction mixed with political relations and also the popular culture and journalism in the state of Ceará. And so my doctoral dissertation was about how, well, the tensions and interactions between traditional knowledge on the environment and meteorology. The local agency, the local meteorological agency in the state of Ceará was created exactly 50 years ago, and with the goal of producing artificial rains or doing cloud seeding. After some years of variable success, cloud seeding was abandoned, and they adopted the approach of doing predictions, of forecasting rains. So from an agency that did cloud seeding, they turned into an agency for forecasting and prediction. But then what happened, so the reason I'm mentioning this thing about doing cloud seeding is that this is the intervention in the ecosystem in a very complicated and interesting way. So many years later, more recently, the talk about geoengineering started to populate the conversations about climate change, right? So geoengineering basically are different technical schemes, very large-scale technical schemes for intervening in ecosystems, some of the Earth systems, in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. So one of the most controversial ones is called solar radiation management. And the idea is to control the amount of solar radiation that reaches the surface of the planet. And this can be done through different ways. One of them is spraying sulfur particles in the stratosphere. So part of the radiation that reaches the planet is reflected back into the space. Right? So basically, it's the creation of a thermostat for the planet. And so very quickly, the environmentalists, the ecological sciences in general, but also social scientists and philosophers strongly reacted against the idea of geoengineering in general and solar radiation management in particular. And for a number of reasons, well, I'll mention just a couple of them. One is that our understanding of the complexities of the ecosystems is really, really shallow. So there's no way we can predict what can happen to the ecosystems around the planet if we reduce the amount of solar radiation. Of course, we know what happens when volcanoes erupt and throw ashes into the atmosphere. So the planet cools down for a few months or perhaps a couple of years. So the idea is mimicking that. But when we interfere in solar radiation, we are interfering with how plants produce oxygen in the entire planet. So it's really risky. This is one thing. The other thing is who exactly will be in control of doing this and for what purpose. So the reactions were really dramatic against it. And then I was coming from studying atmospheric issues and climate in general and politics. And then I realized that something planetary was going on beyond carbon, right? Particularly in what concerns interference. And then at the same time, And at the very moment in which I found out about geoengineering, started reading about it, a book was published. And the book is the book, The Falling Sky, A Queda do Céu in Portuguese, by Yanomami leader and shaman David Kopenhauer and French anthropologist Bruce Albert. And the title of the book caught my attention, The Falling Sky. So I read the book, and it had a really transformative effect on my understanding of not only the atmosphere, but also what I was doing in terms of research. And I was living in Rio at that time. And I read, at the very same moment, I read in the newspaper about this institution called the Chief Coral Snake Foundation. And this is a foundation linked to a group of people that are related to the African Brazilian religious tradition of Umbanda. And what they did is they offered spiritual meteorological services to city governments in order to produce rains or to prevent rains. And I read that in Rio, right? So not a small town in the nowhere in the backlands of Brazil. I read that in a city with a really huge concentration of universities and academic research and so on. And the mayor of Rio hired that institutions for preventing rains during the New Year's Eve fireworks spectacle in the Copacabana beach. And I found that so interesting, because what I read in the Kopenhauer's book, and what was reading about the Chief Coral Snake Foundation, were two examples of interference in the atmosphere that did not generate the same amount of negative reaction as geoengineering was causing in ecological groups in general. Right? So the research question that I decided to adopt is what exactly gets Western scientists when they propose doing such an intervention on the atmosphere, they perceive that they're causing a great risk, and the other side of academia reacts against it. So why there's this negative feeling about geoengineering in academia, and among indigenous shamans, what they feel about interfering in the atmosphere is almost exactly the opposite. It's not that the intuitive idea in the West and the Westernized settings that nature should be left alone simply does not apply to indigenous peoples, because there's no nature. There's no nature that functions automatically. So everything functions connected to other forms of life and intentionalities, and is the task of the shaman to interact all the time with the atmosphere, so reality unfolds properly. That was very interesting. And then there was the case of the Chief Coral Snake, not because of what they said they did, but it's because of how high-level politicians in Brazil were willing to appear in public associated to such religious practices, which would probably not be accepted in other settings and perhaps in other countries. Right? So I took that as my research, and I ended up producing a paper called Outer Geoengineering, where I compared these two attitudes. But at the same time, I never stopped working on a different boundary area of intercultural contact, and that was the relationship between the climate sciences and the social sciences. Very early in my research, I realized that it was very difficult. The conversation was difficult. Interdisciplinary conversations are usually difficult, but particularly the conversation between anthropologists and climate scientists, that was a very difficult conversation, right? Because of the mutual representations and stereotypes involved and so on. And so I ended up writing about this. And so one of the papers that I wrote is the one you see in the bottom here, in which I use one idea that comes from the Brazilian, ethnological sciences, so anthropologists that work with indigenous populations, the idea of controlled equivocation proposed by Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. So I use that idea for analyzing the relationship between social scientists and climate scientists. And at the same time, I started collaborating with climate scientists in projects of co-production. So co-production, the idea that the climate sciences need to produce their knowledge together with users in order to make that knowledge useful, started gaining traction when big funding agencies added that to the requirements of giving grants. So I'm talking about things like the Belmont Forum or the IAI, the Inter-American Institute for Global Change. Even in Brazil, FAPESP, the funding agency in the state of São Paulo, also eventually does that, which is the idea that if you're going to do a large international research on climate sciences, you have to have users together with you and you have to co-produce your results. Of course, the climate scientists didn't know how to do it, not even from scratch. And then they invited social scientists to help. Not that the social sciences did know how to do it either. But then there is this stereotype that if it's about people, we have to bring the social scientists in. So I did a lot of research with social scientists and I published together with them. It was very important for me to keep understanding the universe of the climate scientists and so on. And then I was invited to contribute to a publication that is just out. It's a very, very important publication. My contribution is a minor one with two colleagues from University of Campinas, Jean Miguel and Marco Monteiro. But this is a book that does a very extensive critical assessment of the workings of the IPCC, and it's an open access book. That's why you have this QR code there. It's a very important book for anyone doing research or teaching about things related to climate. And so we were invited to participate in this book, writing a chapter on civic epistemology, so how different countries receive information from these global panels like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and what happens with the information when the information gets into the local political and social dynamics. But this, one of the chapters of this book written by other authors deals exactly with the issue of indigenous knowledge at the IPCC. And what happens in the past, the IPCC, I'll explain what it is in a moment, but the IPCC is older than 30 years now, over 33 decades of working, 6 assessment cycles, right? We are just finishing the 6th cycle of reports. And after all that time, what the authors of the chapter on indigenous knowledge, what they reflect upon is how did indigenous intellectuals and thinkers and leaders and indigenous knowledge in general, how did it participate in the IPCC? And the conclusion is that it almost did not. So I was coming from this comparison between how engineers in the West think about geoengineering and how David Kopenhauer thinks about the atmosphere. And it presents that as how Yanomami shamans do it. But I have this strong perception that David Kopenhauer is a brilliant and very particular philosopher. So I would not immediately generalize his ideas to the entire Yanomami population. Right? So this is what I want to discuss today. Right? First, I will talk about briefly what's the IPCC and what the concept of embodiment has to do with it. And I understand that most of you are medical anthropologists, right? And you may be asking yourselves, how is that related to the things we're doing? And so I will come back to the issue of embodiment. So the point here is understanding what the IPCC does, what kind of knowledge is necessary and required for this kind of work, how indigenous knowledge participates in that, what are the challenges of getting indigenous thinkers to participate, and what David Kopenhauer has to say about it. So David Kopenhauer never, to my knowledge, never explicitly talked about the IPCC, but there's many implications for what he describes in his book with Bruce Albert, in what concerns how science works, how the Western societies work, and how Western knowledge about the atmosphere work or doesn't work. Right? So basically, that's what I want to do here. And I started. This is not a research that I have been doing for a lot of time. I tend to think that I'm in the beginning of this research, but I have one first attempt at trying to understand how could this conversation happen, right? Like IPCC scientists and someone like Oppenhauer. And there's another book, this one that you see on your left. And this is an interesting book organized by Niels Boeband and Thomas Weitzer in Denmark. And the idea of the book was understanding how the thinking of important philosophers is relevant for anthropological fieldwork. So in itself, it's a very interesting idea for a book, but what was most striking for me is that they added David Oppenhauer to the list of philosophers. And then for reasons that I have no idea why, they asked me to write that chapter. So that was really a challenging but interesting exercise in putting Oppenhauer's ideas in conversation with the mainstream ideas of the environmental sciences and ecology in general, right? And so that was the first exercise. What I will talk about today is a further development of that. And what you see in the right is a book that is being published right now, and where a translation of that text into Portuguese was included. So it will be available in Portuguese too. Now, with all that said, I have to explain why I picked the topic, the title that I picked, right? So can the indigenous subaltern speak at the IPCC? Because by doing that, I knew that I was, playing with fire, to put it in some way. So because I was making reference to this very, very famous text, also very debated, controversial to some extent, text by Gayatri Spivak, Can the Subaltern Speak? Right? And so I will explain very quickly why I decided to call my talk what I did. So in that text, first of all, if you don't remember, that was a text written in 1985, so a long time ago, and she was criticizing no one less than Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze. So there was a conversation between Foucault and Deleuze published in a journal in the 80s. I think it was earlier than the 80s. So there was a conversation among both of them, where one of the things that they say was that it didn't make sense for intellectuals in France at that point in time to believe that they were the representatives of the working classes. So what they say, the working classes don't need representatives in much less the intellectual. They don't need intellectuals speaking on their behalf. So the working classes can speak by themselves in the political debates of the moment. Right? And that conversation got Gayatri Spivak to write her famous text, Can the Subaltern Speak? And what she says in this famous text is that what Deleuze and Foucault don't understand is that the possibility of being a philosopher, as they were in the 1980s, the philosopher that can get consciousness about the structures and the conditions that produces their own subjectivities, historically and structurally, and they have enough agency to question that and to change that in some ways molecularly, in the case of Gilles Deleuze, or reacting against disciplinary structures in the case of Foucault. What she says is, first of all, there is a certain historical context that allows that to happen among white males in France. And the fact that they were generalizing it was a huge mistake. And in doing that, they were being as colonial as any colonial authors in the past. And then she brings examples. And one of the examples is the example of the sati in India, in colonial India. Right? You remember what sati is, right? So sati in parts of India, in specific castes and contexts, the wives of the deceased man had to kill herself, throw herself in the fire and the flames. And this is one of the things that the British finished and outlawed when British colonialism started in India, right? And so one of the explosive, bombastic phrases that Spivak uses in her text is that's the white man saving brown women from brown men. But what she puts, the reason she brings the example is that there are people around the planet that they don't have the means for articulating any reaction against a situation of oppression. And in that case, those people need the intervention of allies that are not in their structural situation. So what she proposes is a very specific definition of subaltern. So subaltern is not the oppressed masses. The subaltern, regardless of identity, is someone who is, structurally speaking, devoid of any possibility of any agency of changing hers or his situation regarding oppression. And in the limit, this individual don't even have the language for doing it, don't have ideas and concepts for doing it. So this is what she was referring to when she talks about the subaltern. And the conclusion of the paper, which also became very controversial, is that her answer is no, the subaltern cannot speak. Right? And she was really misunderstood by so many people. And I mean, this text, she had to deal with that for the rest of her life. But the point that she makes, and I think it's really, really relevant, and it came up in many different academic circumstances and types of research, is that the idea that agency exists and is distributed at face value, or exists in just one level of signification and meaning in what concerns political interactions. And then the decolonization of relations means, working on this one level of political relations, right? Does not take into consideration that you may have an upper level of meaning that organizes the game in a way that some players systematically lose, even when they don't even understand why they're losing so systematically. But that's part of the structure of the game in a meta level of organization. In linguistics, an important work about this was developed by Michael Silverstein at the University of Chicago. So it's his work about meta-pragmatics. So meta-pragmatics refers to language use, but the idea is that you have some language ideologies that in a meta level organize language interaction in ways that promote racism and discrimination in ways that people don't even understand what's going on. Because the ideologies of language are naturalized to some point that it becomes non-perceptible without some reflection in a meta level. Right? So as you will see, I think that there's so many implications for this debate, including for what it means to decolonize academia, what it means to decolonize anthropology, what it means to decolonize the Anthropocene, and how we have been using the term decolonization in general, right? And but it also has specific value for understanding what the IPCC has been doing in what concerns the collective imagination about the future and what it has to do with climate. So let me move on to that. What's the IPCC? Let me very briefly explain to you, not assuming that you know. I mean, it's very important, but it's very complicated at the same time because it's part of the UN system, the United Nations system. So the IPCC started was created by the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, and the World Meteorological Organization, WMO. And the idea was getting a large group of scientists to review the literature and produce authoritative reports that could influence decision-making at the political level. So that was the idea. So after decades of a few climatologists doing, personal individual activism on televisions and journals and so on, it was clear that it was not working. So the World Meteorological Organization and UNEP decided to commission these reports. What happens is that this was in 1988. 1988, the IPCC was created. In 1992, the same year of the Rio Environmental Conference, the UNFCCC, so the United Nations Framework for Climate Change, was created. And this is what organizes, this is the main forum for climate politics at the international level. And the way it exists is through annual COP meetings, so the Conference of Parties. Just had one right before the Soccer World Cup or the Football World Cup. We had one in Egypt. So COP 27 happened in Egypt, right? So every year there is a COP. And the COP is where nations get together under this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to negotiate how to collectively tackle the problem of climate change. It was created in 1992. So once again, the IPCC was created in 1988. So in the beginning, the scientists believed that the IPCC would be the arena for international negotiations regarding climate. When the framework convention was created in 1992, it moved to the COP meetings, and then the IPCC gained a new identity. It was a strictly scientific identity. So it became very clear that the role of the IPCC was doing a review of the literature and producing reports summarizing the findings of the literature on climate and climate change. But those reports had to be, the nature of the reports and the format and the language and the message had to be strong and authoritative enough in order to influence decision-making. But, and this is important, as part of the UN system, one key element in the mandate of the IPCC is that it needs to be policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. So this is very important. It needs to be policy relevant, but it cannot be policy prescriptive. Now, how exactly you do that? Some people say that's an impossible mandate, actually. But so this is for us to understand. We start constructing the complications of the engagement with indigenous knowledge and indigenous politics. Right? So what you see in the right side is the structure of the IPCC. So you have a plenary, and the plenary is composed by national delegations. So basically are diplomats from the members of UNEP and WMO, so around 200 nations. And you have the diplomats that negotiate how the reports will be constructed. So the diplomats, they need to approve the general scope of the report and the outline of the content in the beginning of the process. And at the end of the process, particularly the summary for decision makers, for policy makers, what they call the SPMs, the very end of the process, the diplomats, they scrutinize the report line by line, the approval of the report. It's a report of around 20 pages. It takes an entire week for the approval of these 20 pages because every single sentence needs to be approved by a plenary of 200 nations. And one thing is important here, and what's important is, what kind of political organization the UN is. Right? There's no higher level of political power. So the UN is an anarchy, which means that things have to be constructed by consensus. If there is no consensus, things don't move forward. Now you need to construct a consensus among 200 nations on a report that has very important political implications for many, many, many of them. So what happens in the process of approval of the reports? So a lot of political issues are left out, right? So this is one important thing. So the IPCC plenary is the most important level. And then below that, you have the IPCC bureau, where the leadership is, so the people who coordinate the practical work. And then the working groups are where the scientists indeed meet to collect an enormous amount of literature, academic literature, and to read it all and to produce summaries and to systematize it into reports and so on. So the tough work of producing the reports are done by the working groups. Okay? The bureau coordinates the activities, and the plenary approves, particularly the final report and all the summaries for policy makers, right? So here we have like a timeline. I mentioned already the most important elements here, the fact that the Framework Convention was created after the IPCC. So it's not that the IPCC was created because there was a demand from the UN. So the UN body was created after the IPCC, so the Framework Convention. That was an interesting aspect of this story. But then the two things that need to be mentioned here was that in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was approved, and the Kyoto Protocol was an attempt at constructing a global policy for carbon emissions. It was very ambitious. It was never materialized, exactly because it was very difficult. So, and exactly when I say that the UN is an anarchy, it's interesting. If you look at the political sciences, it seems that there are only two examples of real anarchical, in the technical sense, of course, right? I'm not using anarchic in the negative sense. I'm referring to a form of political organization. So the only examples of real anarchies that we have on the planet is the UN and hunters and gatherers. So indigenous peoples in the Amazon and other places around the planet where you don't have a state. Therefore, decisions have to be constructed in ways that don't require a higher level of political power imposing the rules and how people have to behave, right? So very often in the anthropological literature on the Amazonian indigenous peoples is that the chief usually don't have much power because there's no police. So the chief cannot impose his will or her will. Therefore, the chief needs to be very charismatic, very charismatic. He has to do it by, have to convince people to do what he believes is necessary. So the same thing happens at the UN. There's no higher level police. Things have to be constructed by consensus. That's why it is so slow, the process, right? And but at the same time, that's what we have. There's lots of people criticize the United Nations and the way climate negotiations are taking place. So I will argue in a second that it's much better to have this than have nothing. Now, it's been since the fourth cycle of review of the IPCC around 2007, but also there's another platform that mimicked the IPCC. They used the same structure of the IPCC. It's the the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Service, IPBES, right? So it's about biodiversity. The IPCC is about climate. But what happens is, since at least 2007 for the IPCC, and since the beginning of the IPBES in 2012, references about the importance of indigenous knowledge started to appear. And it was increasingly so, up to the point that in last year, in the working group 2 of the IPCC, this is the cover that you're seeing, the Impact, Adaptation, and Vulnerability report. There is an enormous amount of references to the importance of indigenous peoples. So it's saying that they need to be part of how we understand climate change, how we construct adaptation strategies, how we reduce vulnerability, and how we think about mitigation. Right? So it's really impressive. And it's not only at the IPCC and the IPBES, UNESCO has been talking about that for a long time. So in 2019, there was this meeting in Guyana, and the topic of the meeting was exactly mapping indigenous knowledge and local knowledge and how they could be used for working with problems of climate change, right? So all of these reports, what they do at this point is simply a declaration of principles, because they haven't done it yet. And I have to say that my feeling is that they have no idea how to do it. So it's not, so is it, the question here, is it an epistemological question? Is this just a matter of making the climate reports something more multicultural, and so bringing indigenous knowledge and getting them a chapter or this kind of thing? Is this simply a matter of different ways of understanding reality and thinking and representing what it's in reality? And if it's simply an epistemological question, what are the implications for this? But then it may be differently. It may be an ontological conflict, not simply a different way of understanding things, but a much more deeper conflict about what are at stake and what are the elements of this world that is in crisis, right? And if it's an ontological conflict, with what implications, once again? And here is where embodiment is a key thing, right? Because of infrastructures. So when we look at this science and technology, STS literature, one thing, very useful thing that we take from that literature is the idea that knowledge is something that is produced and exists connected to infrastructures. So in order to have knowledge, this that we call knowledge, you need infrastructures of knowledge in place and functioning. And so these infrastructures, they have implications and they affect aspects of what is at stake that very often are not visible and not salient into the debate. In what concerns climate change, the main infrastructure that gets it very complicated is the fact that climate knowledge is constructed through computer models. And these models are, so they are computer softwares, right? So are codes of computers. They're based on mathematical equations that simulate the functioning of the atmosphere. And this has been constructed for 150 years now. It's important to mention that, right? If there's a wonderful book called A Vast Machine by Paul Edwards, that he tells this story of all the path from the creation of the first Western Meteorological Agency in the UK, what now is the UK Met Office, all the way to our ability to run computer models that tell us different scenarios for climate change in 2011 and 2100. Right? So this is a very long story that involved a lot of politics, a lot of development in mathematics, statistics, computing. The development in computing is completely connected to the military history of the West. So the development of nuclear bombs and climate models existed hand in hand because they were using the same math, the same statistics, and the same computers for running. Very often, the only reason there was a supercomputer that was capable of running atmospheric models was, so what made the computer available was the fact that that computer was required for nuclear research, for bombs. And so we get to the point in which in the last 20 years, the models, there is a leap in the quality of the models. They become much more precise than it was in the past. And that's when, in general, in most places around the planet, people start really trusting meteorology. I remember when I was young, people made fun and jokes. There were jokes about meteorologists. When I did my ethnographic fieldwork in Northeast Brazil 20 years ago, there was a lot of jokes about meteorologists. Now I have a teenage daughter. I mean, she has no idea why would someone make a joke about the meteorologist. I mean, it's just something from everyday life. You get your cell phone and you open the app, the weather app, and you see whether it's going to rain or not. And very often it gets it right, right? So the efficacy of the development in the last 2 decades was tremendous. But in order to make it happen, the infrastructure is practically a miracle. So what makes atmospheric predictions possible is the existence of huge databases of weather data at different levels of the atmosphere and across the entire planet, right? And so in order to produce, and of course now we have a very extensive network of sensors distributed across the planet, and they're producing data in real time in an enormous volume. And then you have very powerful data centers connected to the World Meteorological Organizations in different parts of the planet, receiving the tremendous inflow of data and processing the data and making this data available to the models that will run in the supercomputers, right? And so this data can come from satellites, from commercial flights that are collecting data and sending data to WMO in real time, ships around the ocean. You have buoys, and so at the bottom of the slide, the left side, you see buoys on the ocean with sensors distributed across the planet. And in the image on the right, you see the concentration of digital weather stations. And I'm saying digital because there's a lot of non-digital weather stations that also collect data, but then you need more processing from local agencies. So the planet is covered with sensors, entirely covered. And these sensors are producing, it's just like a tremendously complex nervous system that are feeling what's going on in the atmosphere and on the surface, and also underwater, on the oceans, and sending this information to computer centers. And these computer centers are preparing this data, cleaning up, organizing, and sending the data to those people who work with the models. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, very highly skilled, doing difficult but necessary work for making all this planetary infrastructure to work properly. And when COVID started in 2020, and we had a dramatic reduction of commercial flights, the inflow of data from the flights dropped radically, and it affected the models, the quality of the models. So all these infrastructures, they have to be on and functioning in real time all the time. So it's a tremendous amount of work. Right? So the question is, this is what feeds the models, and then the scientists use all those databases together with other data from paleoclimatology research on ice cores and tree rings and so on. And then, so they try to reconstruct the climate history of the planet and also to make projections. So the scenarios that the IPCC uses to make decisions require all this infrastructure working in real time. Now, what the IPCC did up to this day was tremendously important, because the amount of controversy around climate change got reduced dramatically. So if we go back to 2010, there was the ClimateGate thing with East Anglia University, and there were other things in the United States, and after that you had Trump. So there was a lot of controversies popping around, and the IPCC working hard and steadily to engage with those controversies, incorporate criticisms into the functioning of the IPCC, adjusting the criteria for working and keeping the work moving on in order to feed the COPs, the Framework Convention, the Conference of Parties, and so on, with information. So most of the analysts believe that the job was done. So now climate change is part of the imagination of the future for most of the planet. And that was an achievement of having used all this infrastructure for producing that kind of knowledge and getting that knowledge to engage with political decision-making at different levels and scales and so on. So there is this idea that the IPCC was successful in weathering some of the controversies and making climate change an unavoidable part of the current political topics at the UN system and in the national levels too, right? So this is one thing. Now, there's a lot of criticism to the IPCC, a lot of criticism. And I will show some of them here. The most important is that the definition of the future, the way the IPCC imposed a very specific imagination of what the future can be, is completely technocratic and absolutely filtered by the functioning of the diplomatic negotiations of the UN system, in which sensitive things are never discussed or rarely discussed. For instance, degrowth of the economies. So there's growing conversations about the idea that, the belief that economies can keep growing, and at the same time we are going to address the issue of climate change, and the two things are incompatible. So more and more people do think this way now, but nevertheless, degrowth never was considered even an alternative in the IPCC scenarios. So those scenarios restrict the possibilities of imaginations. At the same time, they impose themselves as things with which the governments have to deal with. Right? Okay, so what about indigenous knowledge? Why indigenous knowledge keep being referred to as necessary, but at the same time not used at all, right? So what I'll bring here is some of the things that I heard before starting thinking about the IPCC, but simply working with climate scientists and talking with them about traditional forms of understanding. When I did my research with the farmers in Northeast Brazil, very quickly my friends in meteorology, they told me, no, that's folklore. That's folklore. Clearly, the ecosystem reacts to the approach of humidity, but it's very short term. So the ecosystem can react to the approach of humidity, but never beyond a couple of days, perhaps a couple of weeks. So what they said is the rain prophets can never say anything meaningful about climate, about long-term atmospheric patterns. What they will always say is the very short term, and they may eventually get it right in the very short term. So if the ants are abandoning lowlands in riverbeds, in dry riverbeds, if they're abandoning the dry riverbed and migrating to highlands, so the farmers interpret that as the approaching of rains, because it will rain, the stream flow will increase. If the ants remain in the dry riverbed, they will be washed away. So ants migrate to highlands. So they read these signs, and it's the signs that humidity is approaching. But they cannot say anything about the long term. And then I went to my rain prophet friends, and they told me, no, that's not true. There are trees that have a very long process of developing the fruits. So one of the trees is the juazeiro, so a famous tree of the Northeast because it remains green in the dry season. Well, what they say is the juazeiro, you see the beginning of the fruit formation, and if it's not going to rain in 3 months, the juazeiro will drop the fruit. In the very beginning of the process, it will drop the thing and the fruit will not develop. If the fruit develops, it's a sign that the season will be good a couple of months from now, right? So this is about long term. This is about climate, not weather. But then the science erases that systematically, and there are many arguments that are presented for that. One is that it's simply a culture or a worldview, and it's mythological. So in the paper that I presented, Copenhagen and the environmental sciences that I showed to you, that it was just appeared in Portuguese. What I say that is that the category of culture can be used as a form of political neutralization of forms of knowledge that are not scientific, particularly if you call it a worldview, because there is an assumption that reality is the same for everyone, and science is, among all forms of approaching reality, science is the most effective, and it's the real one, right? So this is one way of erasing indigenous knowledge. The other thing is it's not peer reviewed, so there's no criteria for selecting what's high quality, what's not high quality. Then it's too local, so it may even be very precise, very rational, but it's too spatially restricted. And we see that in the IPBES report. So the IPBES says one of the important, and the IPBES is full of anthropologists and indigenous leaders, but also full of environmental scientists, and the negotiations are very complicated, right? So that you see that in a report doesn't say anything about the excellent anthropologists who engage in those debates. The only thing that we can take from that is that they were not capable of engaging in a deeper discussion about this. Well, what we read is local and indigenous knowledge systems are locally based, but produce regional impacts and therefore are globally relevant. So there's so many things in this phrase, right? Well, one of them is they can only say meaningful things about the local scale. And since we are talking about the global scale, there's no reason to call indigenous knowledge holders. We can use their knowledge, but there's no reason for them to be in the conversation. And then one thing that I think is a key element is the element that the indigenous knowledge is too teleological or religious. Indigenous knowledge makes continuous reference to spirituality. And it's obviously non-Christian spirituality. But the problem here is most of the Northern scientists, they have a Christian background, and they have this knee-jerk reaction that associate spirituality to some form of magic that was part of the debates and the wars between Catholics and Protestants in Europe, right? So Protestants always accused Catholics of being magicians or believing in magic and this kind of, because of the miracles and this kind of thing, right? So so the indigenous people talk about spirituality that has nothing to do with Christian spirituality. But even non-religious scientists from the north, they tend to come with a cultural background that associates spirituality to all the nightmares of the wars between religion and science of the 19th century. And they immediately reject that. Right? I'll come back to this because this is important. So, and ultimately, and this is something that the indigenous people say all the time, the category of knowledge is one way of enacting erasure, because the concept of knowledge, as it is understood in the West, tends to be disembodied and decontextualized, while perhaps a more proper way of referring to how indigenous peoples develop what we call indigenous knowledge is indigenous modes of life or indigenous modes of existence. When we say knowledge, we are making reference to this practice of decontextualizing and disembodying forms of relations. Okay, and then, but then there is the direct criticism of the indigenous people. So this is 2 reports produced last year, and it's a reaction of the International Working Group of Indigenous Affairs. So it's an international group of indigenous organizations, and they analyzed in these 2 reports the IPCC last reports and made a series of criticisms and suggestions about how to improve the participation of indigenous knowledge and indigenous leaders. But there's other things too, like all this in reaction to IPCC reports. All of these materials were published after the publication of the 3 first reports of this last review cycle, which means the IPCC reports of last year. They were published in February and March and April. So what you see on the left here was produced in the United States by indigenous, what they call tribal environmental professionals. It's a group of indigenous thinkers in the US. They produced what they call the Indigenous US Climate Report. So it's the status of tribes and climate change report. It's a very, very important document. And then there was this other report that was produced in the end of 2022. It's called Intangible Cultural Heritage, Diverse Knowledge Systems, and Climate Change. So this addresses many of the issues I'm mentioning here, and including one of them, which is relevant to be discussed here, which is that an attempt, it's still happening, but it was more prevalent a few years ago. So you had environmental scientists together with social scientists going to indigenous villages and applying surveys, trying to collect information about the perception of individuals about the changes in the ecosystems. And then from organizing databases with those indigenous perceptions of changes in the ecosystems in order to have a large database of how indigenous peoples are perceiving climate change across the planet. Then for doing what? Ultimately, for connecting the database of indigenous signals and perceptions of climate change with the data that is produced by the sensors and the stations, in order to integrate the 2 forms of knowledge, right? So there are lots of people doing it, and it's a very interesting work, but it's also very risky. And it's risky because it decontextualizes indigenous knowledge in such a way that it may be a wrong characterization of what indigenous knowledge is. And you have many leaders mentioning that. And perhaps the most important aspect is the fact that when indigenous leaders talk about their knowledge about what's going on in the ecosystems, most of the times they will make reference to spiritual dimensions of reality that are necessary for the understanding of what's going on. But without a spiritual element, the rest of the thing doesn't make sense. But that's exactly what these scientists are doing. They're getting there documenting objective observations or practical observations of changes in the ecosystems, discarding the spiritual message, bringing the observations into databases in order to integrate to other databases in order to make models more precise, right? So at the same time that this is, may be very interesting, actually, I mean, the results may be valuable, interesting, it is a decharacterization of indigenous knowledge. That's not indigenous knowledge. Bird watchers do it. People who, cultivate flowers, they do the same thing. They know that the birds are coming back from migration on a different moment because of climate change. You don't have to be indigenous. Or, botanists, they understand that flowers are flowering, the plants are flowering at a different moment because of climate change. What makes indigenous knowledge indigenous, and there's no such a thing as this homogeneous indigenous people, right? So we're talking about a kind of a political construction in order to function in the level of debates at the UN. So it's a number of political indigenous organizations, all of them always making this explicit statement that the indigenous peoples are very heterogeneous. But nevertheless, the spiritual element seems to be present in most of the instances of the message. So this second report here, the one on the right, discusses these issues, are very important. And many of the authors have experience in being at the IPCC or the IPBES. Now, I will summarize what these reports, because they criticize specifically the IPCC reports. So let's see what these indigenous intellectuals, how they criticize the reports of the IPCC. I'm going to be very brief about this because I want to talk about Copenhagen. So the first thing is, this complete absence of indigenous authors and leadership among the IPCC leaders. They're not even considered, right? And the second is the non-recognitions of indigenous participants when they do participate as such, but instead as member of national delegations. So homogenizing a national delegation. So you have the Canada delegation, where often you do have indigenous peoples, and they are just considered to be part of the Canadian delegation. And then the protocols for the selection of sources exclude indigenous sources, but the thing about having to use peer-reviewed materials, right? So non-indigenous sources are used instead. It tends to be secondary sources about indigenous knowledge. There's also this erasure of agency. Indigenous people have systematically been represented as victims. And that's exactly how the 2030 agenda, UN agenda, refers to indigenous peoples. If you look at the 17 SDG, the Sustainable Development Goals, that's exactly how the indigenous people feature in the SDGs, as victims of unsustainable practices, right? So this erasure of agency is important. Then there's this non-recognition of the historical and present-day colonial violences as causes for current context of vulnerability and inequality. So there's a complete depoliticization of the reports. And I explained why, right? So there is the functioning of the UN system produces this depoliticization. And then the non-recognition of diversity and intersectionality among indigenous peoples. Like indigenous women have different problems that don't apply to all indigenous peoples, and indigenous peoples are different in different continents. Even inside of Brazil, there are over 300 different indigenous groups, right? And also, there's this tendency of connecting indigenous peoples to tropical forests. So the Amazon has such a strong weight in the imagination of what this whole thing is. Well, you have indigenous peoples in all ecosystems on the planet. And in what concerns the IPCC, the Inuit of the Inuit Circumpolar Council are the most active ones. And as I mentioned, the indigenous relevance reduced to local context, and then the erasure of spirituality, I also mentioned that, and also the non-recognition or the non-discussion that some mitigation propositions will have adverse impacts on indigenous peoples and lands. Now, the idea of getting all cars around the planet to be electric will promote mining for lithium in indigenous lands. This is very clear. So, pushing for electric cars will have a weight and an adverse effect on indigenous peoples. Now, I think that the most ambitious climate change plan in history on this planet at this point is the US Inflation Reduction Act that was approved last year. Right? Now, the reason I mention it here is that for you to have an idea what despite of the fact that the US Inflation Reduction Act, when the Biden administration approved this, doesn't seem to make reference to climate change, but the climate change is embedded inside of this act. So for you to have an idea what they propose, they're proposing creating solar panel farms, turbine farms that are so extensive that it will take an area, they will need, the cheapest version will take an area inside of the United States that's equivalent to France. Now imagine this, inside of the United States, an area equivalent to France turning into solar panel farms and wind turbine farms. And then you ask, whose lands will be used for this? Clearly, this will imply violence against the indigenous. There's no doubt about it. No one has any doubt about it. And then there are other alternatives, not as cheap as this one. And the other alternatives imply increasing dramatically the amount of nuclear plants in the United States. And then we just have to look at the history of what was done with nuclear garbage in the United States and how it ends up in indigenous lands. So this is really an important thing that there's simply not one word in the IPCC. Right? And also the idea that the indigenous peoples are victims don't take in consideration the fact that many of the indigenous groups are working on adaptation and mitigation for a long time already, right? And just by conserving woodlands and forests and so on, but many other things. And then there's the thing that the technocratic frames and lenses distort the perception of present and the imagination of futures, and distort also how mechanisms of things like this RED is a mechanism for paying local communities to protect the forest. Now, the evaluation of how it is done very often is done according to principles that don't reflect the indigenous perception. So very technocratic. So this is what we see on criticism coming from the indigenous leaders. Now, just wanted to I will move fast because I want to finish so we have time for discussion. But the thing here is that the UN, this is the red arrows is where UNEP and WMO are located. So the UN system really, who plays the game of the UN is the nations. And now you imagine the United States under Trump or the Brazil under Bolsonaro, or the UK under Boris Johnson and other people. But the UK don't have to deal with things as the indigenous people now as Brazil and the United States. Now imagine the United States and Brazil sending their delegations to UN negotiations. So what's the chance of having any of these criticisms attended when you have the governments like this? So this is a real challenge, right? Okay, so what I'll briefly mention now is how the ideas of, so what I just presented is a series of harsh criticisms from indigenous thinkers about how the thing happens on the IPCC and why their participation is, it doesn't exist at this point, in any meaningful way, but it will be very difficult. Right? Now, what I wanted to present here is some of the ideas of David Kopenawa and show that they are much more radical than anything that was presented so far. And they are more radical because they get into the issue of spirituality. So when in the previous slide, I said, is it an epistemological problem or is it an ontological problem? So if it's epistemological, what's the implications? And if it's ontological, what are the implications? Now, what David Kopenawa brings in his book puts the entire problem in a different equation, right? So I'll quickly say some things. Now, just to mention that his book was already translated into it was originally published in French, was translated into 3 languages, and 3 more languages will appear soon. I think it's Spanish, German, and Korean. So what I want to say here is what's important for David Kopenawa is, I mean, the book is not about science, but what I'm extracting from the book is how Western science relates to the care of the environment. So how is science part of caring for the environment? Why would indigenous leaders want to participate on the IPCC if the IPCC is a scientific body? Or should the indigenous leaders want to participate in the IPCC, right? So now, from the perspective of someone like David Kopenawa was born in the middle of the Amazon forest, and the first time he saw a non-indigenous person, he was already, he was a child, but I mean, when he started engaging with non-indigenous persons, he was a teenager. So he really grew in the traditional modes of life of the Yanomami. And the Yanomami territory has very difficult access. So it kept them undisturbed, not uncontacted, but to some degree undisturbed for a longer period than other peoples in Brazil, right? But the point here is from his perspective, and looking at the Amazon case, and also I will need to bring some ideas from Amerindian perspectivism. It's a theory developed by Eduardo Viveiros de Castro and some of his colleagues, right? But the point here is this, from someone in the position of David Kopenawa, what he sees at the same time is there was not this amount of scientific research in the Amazon as any point in the past. There's really, really a surge in scientific research in the Amazon in the last 20 years. What we know about the Amazon, what science knows about the Amazon today is very different from what was known 20 years ago. And that is because the entire planet is doing research on the Amazon. So you have Chinese, German, Swiss, French, British, Canadian, Australian teams working in the Amazon, and lots of Brazilian teams also working in the Amazon all the time. And David Kopenawa sees that. At the same time, the amount of destruction is tremendous. I mean, we cannot say that it's the worst moment in history because that's a very sad history. It's not really a happy history. So there were other moments there was tremendous destruction. But right now, after the Bolsonaro government, what happens in the Amazon is an incredible amount of destruction. It's not simply cutting the trees. What you see there, Dario Kopenawa will talk about this because this is a photo of the Yanomami reservation. So they destroy the soil in search for gold. So you have a lot of science and you have a lot of destruction at the same time. What would someone like Kopenawa conclude? That there's no connection between knowing and caring. In practice, I mean, the white people or the Westerners, the non-indigenous Brazilian, they may believe that there are all these complicated connections between knowing the forest and protecting the forest, and the whole thing is very complicated. In practice, from the perspective of David Kopenawa, it's hubris, right? It's simply not effective. Well, so so what does make the traditional model life of the Yanomami more effective in taking care of the forest? So, and now there is a lot of scientific evidence demonstrating that indigenous peoples living according to their traditional modes of life are as effective or more than the most strict conservationist forms of protection, right? So you have, sometimes you have the total protection areas. Total protection areas are areas in which you cannot have any human being inside of the area, including indigenous. Now, if you compare total protection areas with indigenous reservations, I mean, evidence demonstrates that in most of the cases, indigenous, even when indigenous people are doing their gardens, cutting trees, and hunting animals, the biodiversity is promoted rather than reduced. So what explains that? This is the thing, this is very relevant for the dialogue with the environmental scientists. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to construct the possibility of this conversation. So trying to look for a framing of Schopenhauer's ideas that would be appropriate for audiences in the environmental sciences, right? So the first one is rejection of human exceptionalism. So other forms of life are not less special than humans. It's more than that. There are many non-human peoples. So subjectivity, human subjectivity exists in different types of bodies, not only human bodies. So this general perception of indigenous peoples in the Amazon is that the animals, they think and they have the social lives that are pretty much exactly the same as the humans, but we cannot see it because of our bodies. And then they also cannot see our way of living because the body is the way of perceiving reality. And also a shaman, the person, particularly a shaman, is a tangle of agencies. And in the case of Schopenhauer, he's talking about the Shapiri, where, for the lack of a better expression, the spirits of the forest, the spirits of the agencies of the forest, the animals and trees and the stars and the moon and the sun and so on. So it's the the entanglement of these agencies that craft the personality of the shaman. A shaman cannot be a shaman without being directly connected, spiritually connected to a large network of spiritual entities. So therefore, nature does not exist. What makes a difference in the world is an agent with intentionality. Language is not conventional, so there's no this disconnection between the way we speak and reality. Language is deeply connected to how reality is produced. And the knowledge of the other non-human peoples is impossible. We cannot understand the world of the jaguar because we have different bodies. So the shaman can encounter the shaman of the jaguars doing shamanic activities. But that's different from mapping out the world of the jaguar. So this has a philosophical implication that's very important. Shamans don't pretend that they will understand everything perfectly. They understand that they cannot know most of reality. There's an impossibility of knowing large parts of reality, and they have to live with that, not knowing. And relations are dangerous because there are predators. Right? So the idea that humans don't have predators, this is not only make-believe, this is it produces irresponsibility. So, but they do accept that they have predators, and so they have to function in a world in which they don't understand it all, but they have to manage relations that are dangerous because of the relations, relations of predation. So the result of this is that life exists in a very dense context. Movement is difficult, and every important act is a complex political negotiation. Like hunting. Hunting involves political negotiation. Cutting trees depending on the trees and the circumstances, involve some form of political negotiations with spiritual entities, right? So therefore, life is the freedom of movement gets tremendously reduced, right? Now, if we add that to a cultural and a social political order that prevents material accumulation, right, and there is this explicit rejection of inequality. Pierre Clousters wrote a famous book called Societies Against the State, right? It's not that they don't know what a state is, they didn't get to the point of developing, they do know what it is, and they reject that. So, and you combine it all, and the result is protection of biodiversity. So the conclusion here is that care is a precipitated from this ontological architecture, is not a conscious and voluntary action. Indigenous people, they don't have to protect the environment in most of the circumstances. Now they do have to protect, because they see it in places like Brazil, non-indigenous Brazilians destroying everything. But in the most general, traditional circumstances, they promote biodiversity, not having that as a goal, but simply because that is a quote unquote precipitate from a certain ontological architecture. For living the way they live, and understanding reality the way they understand, it gets them into relations that promote care, even if care is not the goal, and promote biodiversity, even if they don't even have a word for biodiversity, but it ends up producing, right? Now, so what's the message? What's the message for the IPCC? What's the message for environmental scientists? The message is the ontological architecture of Western knowledge needs to be taken as a variable. We need to be able to think about the ontological architecture, how we know reality and why we know the way we know, and what are the effects of knowing reality as we do it, right? In this disembodied way, decontextualized. Now, of course, there's a lot of works in the literature that refer to that. But let me mention one, and I'm finishing now, by Bruno Latour. Bruno Latour died a few months ago, but his last book was a very short book called After Lockdown. And in this book, he gets to exactly the same conclusions, but from a complete different reflection. What he talks about ants and insects and how they interact with each other and so on. Conclusion is, what we went through during lockdown was the perception of relations that we don't often perceive, but we have to perceive the relations in order to protect the communities. So what is he talking about? He's talking about the fact that one of the things that we went through during lockdown is we have to use masks, because if I don't do it and I'm contaminated, but I don't have the symptoms, I may infect a colleague that is as healthy as I am, and this colleague may infect his grandmother, who is not as healthy, and the grandmother may end up dying. So the idea of using masks, even if I'm not having and don't have any symptom, and I believe I'm perfectly healthy, and now we know that there's so many other things, right? I'm trying to think about what was it, the beginning of the debate about using masks and doing lockdowns and so on. So what Bruno says is, well, we started thinking about relations and seeing relations in ways that we didn't see before, and that dramatically restricted our freedom of movement, because we started taking those relations in consideration. So his conclusion is, this is life in the new climate regime. We have to be able to see relations that we don't usually see, and it will necessarily restrict our freedom of movement when we start perceiving these relations. And what are these relations? Well, it can be so many relations. Like, for instance, I have colleagues who from the environmental sciences, right? And they work they do research on maritime ecosystems, so fish and mammals in the ocean and so on. And a few of them are ecotoxicologists, so they study pollution. And the effects of pollution on ocean biodiversity and ocean ecosystems. And it's incredible what they are finding, and people in other parts of the planet are getting to the same results. You have fish under the influence of psychiatric medication. You have fish under the influence of caffeine. You have fish under the influence of painkillers. You have fish under the influence of human hormones. And all this affecting, the trophic networks, like a fish under, psychiatric medication, depending on the medication, the fish tends to be more relaxed and to get closer to predators. And by doing it, the fish is eaten, and in a frequency higher than without the chemical compound, which means that it gets an imbalance in the trophic cascade and the food chains and so on. Now, have we ever asked pharmaceutical companies to do this kind of tests? We never did it because we never even thought about it, right? But this is the kind of relations we have to monitor. So what Bruno was saying is we need to see relations that we didn't see before, and therefore, that will restrict our freedom of movement, and life after in the new climate regime will be like that. This is the message of his last book. It is tremendously similar to what Schopenhauer is saying in his book about how he understands the Yanomami understanding of reality, and why the non-indigenous are so destructive, because they don't see it all. They don't see. This is also a very interesting part of Schopenhauer's argument. It says the non-indigenous peoples simply don't see the most important part of reality. Even science cannot see some of the most important dimensions of reality, particularly the spiritual dimension. So the spiritual dimension is where things really happen. So the material dimension is the results of what happens in the spiritual dimension. And then he says, well, the white people simply cannot see it. That's why they destroy it all. They destroy the land that feeds them. This is his. So my last slide, is the IPCC ready for such transformation? I mean, having indigenous people inside of the IPCC with these kinds of ideas, right? So is the IPCC the proper venue for the discussion? Or perhaps the UN framework for climate change, the COP meetings, the biodiversity reports. So how is the IPCC placed in this alternative, right? Now, the fact that the IPCC is intergovernmental has an interesting implication. The implication is the history of the IPCC demonstrates that very often national governments can influence the direction of the scientific research. So sometimes the national delegations, they ask questions to the scientists that the scientists don't have answers. And what they do is they go back to their labs and they start doing the research in order to answer the questions that the diplomats brought to the debate. So it's very interesting. And sometimes people think that that's a bad thing because science should not be, quote unquote, polluted by politics. But the thing is, now in Brazil, we have indigenous individuals inside of the national government. We have a ministry for the indigenous peoples. For the first time in the national history, the director of the indigenous agency, FUNAI, is an indigenous person. So the role and hopefully the power of indigenous leaders inside of the Brazilian national government will be from now on something that we never saw before. The question here is, can this have an effect on the IPCC? Perhaps some of these leaders will be inside of the Brazilian delegation. in coalition with delegations like Canada and New Zealand, perhaps new things may appear in IPCC because of this, novel political circumstances. But that's something for us to watch. Now, but two things are certain: the future relevance of the IPCC, and there may be one of the main possible futures is the IPCC losing relevance. This is in the book that I mentioned in the beginning. Well, if the IPCC will remain relevant or not depends on its capacity to transform itself profoundly. The first one is being more politicized. The IPCC needs to deal with political hot potatoes. And the leadership is currently trying to find ways of doing that. And the second thing is the IPCC needs a much stronger participation from the social sciences, the humanities, the indigenous peoples, and other traditional knowledge holders. Without that, most certainly the IPCC will lose relevance because there is this perception that the key scientific questions were answered already. What are left are political questions. I'm sorry that I took that long, and I hope we still have time for interaction, and so that's my presentation. Let me stop sharing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this magnificent exposé, Professor Renzo, and for showing us how this infrastructure is organized around knowledge about the atmosphere and other questions about the climate change. I don't know if we have some time. I think we can finish the session. Maybe if someone wants to add something quickly.
So I added my email here in case someone, if you run out of time and someone wants, I have time, we can stay here, but if we have to finish, someone who would like to keep going, we can interact over email.
That's great. So on behalf of the Embodied Inequalities project, I would like to thank Professor Renzo immensely. Unfortunately, we don't have much time for a discussion, but with your email, this will be possible afterward. I'm sure we will continue that on another time. And thank you very much, Renzo.
I thank you. This is always a pleasure, and it was a privilege to interact with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. Thank you, Renzo.
Thank you. Yeah, now we need to read Copenhagen.
Yes, yeah, before the next seminar.
Well, let me say this. The two authors, David Copenhagen and Bruce Albert, I mean, the long-time collaboration, they are just about to publish a new book in April now.
Yeah.
So for you to have an idea of the impact of the book, if you go to Google Scholar and you put the name of the book, it has more than 1,000 citations, and this is a really difficult book to read. I mean, it's not that it's like a book that you read and immediately you realize that, oh, that's so relevant. It's a very difficult book, and it has over 1,000 citations. It's tremendous. And The Spirit of the Forest is the next book that they will release in April.
Obrigado, Renzo. Muito bom.
Obrigado, Jean.